So we're in your world history book in chapter 12, section 3. I'm going to be talking about the tyranny of Napoleon. Section 2 is finishing up with the French Revolution. And so we're going to see where the French Revolution finally ends up. So in 1799, Napoleon returned to Paris from a military campaign in Egypt. He had gained great prestige through his military genius. He defeated counter-revolutionaries in France and in the Austrian army in Italy, and he devised a plan to invade Egypt and even menace the British interests in the Mediterranean in India. So who is Napoleon and who is he fighting? Well, he's a revolutionarist. So he's from the revolution, the French Revolution, and he wants to put together. So he's very much an atheist, and he's very much an enlightenment, but he's also a military genius. And he's fighting, of course, he's fighting the British, and he's fighting the Austrians in Italy, but he's also fighting anyone that comes counter to the revolution. Coalition against France. Suddenly, France is looked at as the revolution wanting to take over all of Europe. So Great Britain, Austria, Russia, and Turkey form an alliance to fight against France at this point in this revolutionist that was happening. And Napoleon was defeated in Egypt. Napoleon at this time, he's basically just heading the armies. He's not in charge at all. But he was defeated in Egypt. So, the English had defeated him, and he is coming back, and you think that he'd come back as being down and disappointed and being defeated, but he was popular in France. So France gave him a hero's welcome as he came home to France as a revolutionary. So the Directory, remember the Directory, that's the government they have then, another one, the fifth one they had, were planning another change in the government. And so Napoleon knew this, and so he planned on being a part of this change. Here we have the Directory organizing, and he's knowing that's what's going to happen here, and so he's going to want to be part of this. So Napoleon was age 30. He was the charismatic leader to lead this group, right? So he needed to take control. So on November 9th, 1799, Napoleon drove the legislators from their bedchambers in the middle of the night and proclaimed a new republic, a new republic now called the Consulate. And he was going to head this consulate and be the first consul. And so Napoleon, of course, he drew up a new constitution. So here we have, you noticed this here, this secret sign. Before we thought, man, does he have a stomach ache or what? And he did later on have stomach cancer. And so people thought that. But then we see a lot of different people, a lot of different men of this age and even to come that have this. It's actually a secret sign. And it's a secret sign of the Illuminati that had merged with Freemasons back when. And we find that Napoleon indeed was a Freemason and basically spread the Masonic Lodge to countries all over the place. Him and Josephine both, which I just found out recently. I always wondered, what in the world is he doing there? But anyway, so now we have this new constitution drawn up, by Napoleon. A plebiscite is an election of the people's will. So he wanted to make sure that it was an election of what the people wanted. So Napoleon actually gave them little choice but to accept his constitution. But he established a make-believe parliament and a make-believe system that was electing him in charge. The real power was in the first consul. Basically, that was him, Napoleon. Napoleon Bonaparte, like many dictators, came in power during this turmoil, the chaos of the French Revolution. And he promised peace and prosperity. Don't all dictators promise that? He certainly did. Napoleon's shrewd diplomacy. Well, he broke up the coalition against France by making temporary peace. So he starts doing some things to show that he's going to do a good job, right? You know, even though things are not like they seem. So he broke up the coalition against France by making his temporary peace with Russia, England, and Austria by 1802. He says, well, we're at peace. And his internal reforms claimed that he's claimed to be the son of the revolution. So he was going to promise liberty, equality, and justice. Remember, it was liberty, equality, and fraternity and death? Well, he took off the death. And he took off the fraternity and liberty, equality, and justice now. So he's thinking a little bit different to get the people to like him more, which they did. The taxes were going to be collected by professional tax collectors that were armed professional, really. So he was going to have the tax collectors were going to come in and make sure that everyone paid their taxes. And that included the wealthy. So, and this was going to be a very highly centralized national government. And he, again, basically in control. Code Napoleon, it was called. The new laws. So it was most famous since the time of the Romans, Code Napoleon, the Code of Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon made peace, he did make peace with the Catholic Church. Really? How did he do that? Well, he went in 1801, signed the Concordat that agreed with the Pope. He said, I'll agree with you, Pope. To Napoleon, religion was a tool. Napoleon's practice was to claim to be a follower of whatever religion of whomever he was dealing with at a time. He didn't care if they wanted to be Catholic, he'd be Catholic, or whatever religion there was, he would just take it. Because he did not believe in religion, of course. He was a devout revolutionist and atheist, or I should say a deist. Believed in there was a God, but that God had not very many contacts with us, and surely didn't believe in the salvation of Jesus Christ. The French Empire. Well, Pope Pius VII went to Paris and bestowed the seal of consecration on Napoleon. You know, so here comes the Pope. And at the Notre Dame Cathedral, and he's with his wife, Josephine. There's Napoleon and Josephine dressed in their royal, now thinking they're in charge in royalty. And the presence of all the dignitaries there, you can imagine. And Napoleon declared that he was didn't use the word king, but he would be emperor of the French. Now, basically, Pope Pius declared him emperor. So now he had the sanction of the Roman Catholic Church on his dictatorship. Napoleon placed the crown himself on his head. He wasn't going to have the Pope place it on his head. He placed it on his head himself in arrogance. But Napoleon, we're going to see some of his failures. Well, he had a failure in the New World. Remember that France owned a big portion of North America, not from Canada all the way down to the Louisiana territory, in the middle of our country. So a huge amount of land. And Napoleon intended to rule it, and he wanted to use this territory as a breadbasket to feed his workers in the French Indies and his workers. And he just wanted to basically to use it to feed his soldiers wherever. But the plans for his empire in the New World collapsed. There was a slave revolt in Haiti, and all these things were going on. And Napoleon had no time. He was headed to rule Europe, right? And so he had a lot of military campaigns, and the territory seemed absolutely useless to him. So Napoleon decided to sell it to the United States in 1803, and then concentrated on conquering Europe, which he wanted to do. So here we have Thomas Jefferson. Here's a picture of Thomas Jefferson meeting up with Napoleon, bringing in, as to a petition to buy, the Louisiana Purchase. And Napoleon sold it to him for quite a great deal for the United States. I can't remember. I think it was like 2 cents an acre or something ridiculous. And so Thomas Jefferson went happily back thinking the Louisiana Purchase now. And actually it's one of the greatest things because you see, if this hadn't happened, Napoleon and France would be ruling our country, at least the middle of our country, right? And we'd all be speaking French, and we'd have probably 3 countries, New France. But Napoleon, because he was so interested in conquering Europe, needed that money. So he gladly sold the Louisiana Purchase. The Battle of Trafalgar. The Battle of Trafalgar on October 21st, 1805. The British Navy came through and destroyed the French and Spanish fleet had come into the Strait of Gibraltar there. And so as they came in, the English was actually one of the greatest sea battles. Of course, England had a great navy. England was supreme on the seas, their navy, for 140 years. And the commander, Lord Horatio Nelson, that lived 1758 to 1805, but he was the greatest naval hero of the time. And he was actually known as the greatest naval hero of the world has ever known. So, and he was mortally wounded by the French and Spanish. Mortally wounded. But as he was mortally wounded here, he was dying on the below deck, he kept issuing orders to make sure that the victory would be complete. He knew that he had to win this battle against France or Napoleon would take over the world. And so when Lord Nelson spoke his last words, he said, "Thank God I've done my duty," as the British won the Battle of Trafalgar. The Battle of Austerlitz. Battle of Austerlitz, Napoleon wins that. That's one of his greatest wins. Napoleon crushed a combined Austrian and Russian army. And one of the greatest victories of Napoleon's career was the Battle of Austerlitz. For 7 years, he overcame, as the French armies were forced Austria. He overcame the Austrians and Prussia and Russia and made a peace with them. So Napoleon makes a peace with all of these. But really, those countries he had in his control now, he felt. So as his peace was not really a peace, but a control of Austria, Prussia, and Russia. He dissolved the Holy Roman Empire now and occupied the German states also. And he sent troops and occupied Spain, the Netherlands, and Italy, the Italian states, and put his brothers on the thrones. So he had Napoleons on the thrones of all these places, Spain, Netherlands, Italy. He put his brothers in charge. And their names were Napoleon too. But he was Napoleon Bonaparte. By 1812, Napoleon dominated virtually all of Europe. So the Battle of Austerlitz, Napoleon's win, rolled him into winning more and more. Here's a picture of Napoleon. As he went into these battles, he would lead the battles. He wasn't just directing them from a distance or from Paris. He was a military leader. And so you would see him in these pictures, and he would go in, as he went into the battles, he would lead them. Napoleon's life. Well, Napoleon was married to Josephine, and they were married for quite a long time. But when he was 40 in 1809, he divorced Josephine because she gave him no children. Another one of those cases. He wanted to have a son because he did feel like he was the emperor now and he would need to have an heir, right? A male heir. So he married Marie Louise, who was only 18 years old and he was 40. And she happened to be, can you believe it, the niece of Marie Antoinette. So he married her niece because he knew now everyone would say, well, now the bloodlines was surely going to be the bloodline of a king and an emperor both, right? So he had, his ideas of what he was going to do. Napoleon was very shrewd, and he was very conniving and thinking of these things. Now, when I think about Josephine, she too, they both were, when you look back at that time, they were both involved in the revolution. Then not only revolutionaries, they had of course, their secret meetings of this, I call it Illuminati, but it was basically the Masons. And she actually was as a woman, starting the first women Masons, Freemasons lodges. Can you believe that? That's crazy. But now, after he divorced her and married this niece of Marie Antoinette, now he thought he was true royalty. And Marie Louise indeed bore him a son to the throne, his throne as emperor. The continental system, he actually put this together because his worst enemy was Britain. Britain had already destroyed his ships on the sea, and they had been, like I said, 170 years in charge of the seas, really, in their navy. So he decided in 1806 to forbid the importation of British goods into any European country under his control. They could not trade with Britain. He even drew America in this whole thing in the War of 1812. But Europe could not get along without British imports. And so there's a lot of smuggling of British imports all over the place. And many started turning against Napoleon's regime, these countries that he was controlling. Can you see here? Areas barred from importing British goods. So you can see these, here's France and then all these purple areas. He had Spain, Norway, Sweden, all these areas that he had his control at that time that could not trade with Britain. England. The reaction against tyranny. So for a long time, Europe seemed to welcome him and said, well, he is controlling and he is protecting us, because he did away with feudalism, and they were really sick and tired of the kings and queens and their attitudes. And he instituted, some of his laws were quite famous, and he seemed to establish the rights of men in a form of equality. But they began to realize they had exchanged their national monarchy that they possibly wanted to get rid of for a new kind of tyranny, and an international tyranny. So the growing spirit of nationalism played a part in the fall of Napoleon. The nations started to rise against Napoleon. Nations wanted to be independent of him. Revolts and excommunication. So now Napoleon, he's got to fight to hold on what he has. But not only that, Napoleon wants to conquer the world. In 1808, a long and bloody guerrilla warfare in Spain, and the French brutally suppressed the Spanish, had happened. And Napoleon had a quarrel with the Roman Church, the Roman Catholic Church. And he was excommunicated now by the Pope. The same Pope, Pope Pius, who proclaimed him emperor, decided to excommunicate him. So things were turning on Napoleon. A fatal mistake. I'm going to stop there and we're going to go on. What is this fatal mistake? Let's just say his fatal mistake was very, very cold.